Good evening, everyone. Welcome first to all of you who are joining us via live stream. I've been told that's a very large number. And to all of you who are here at what we call the Old Tishman Auditorium. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Joel Towers, and I am a University Professor of Architecture and Sustainable Design. I am also the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center and a co-chair of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. I mention these three because it is not an exaggeration to say that were it not for the mentorship and the encouragement of our guest this evening, I would not hold any of these roles. It is my profound honor, together with my colleagues at the Tishman Center, the faculty and the students across the university, and especially my dear friend, Professor Miodrag Mitrosinovic, to welcome Kenneth Frampton to the New School. In a few moments, Miodrag will seek to accomplish the impossible task of situating Kenneth's unparalleled body of work in the context of architectural history, theory, criticism, and writing. He will also provide some of the more salient biographical pieces of information. My task is thankfully more grounded. To me falls the joy of welcome, to remind you, as if that was in any way necessary, of how special this evening will be. I've known Kenneth for 35 years, which in the panoply of Frampton admirers places me somewhere in the middle. He was already a towering figure in the field when I had the privilege of being a student in his modern architecture course at the GSAPP, the foundational text for which he had completed 7 years earlier. Several years later, Kenneth would review an early project from the office that I had founded together with Carla Rothstein. And when I began to teach at Columbia, I got to know Ken as a faculty colleague and a mentor. Indeed, across the entire arc of my career as an architect, a teacher, a dean, and a scholar working at the intersection of architecture and environment, I have always been learning from Ken. So many of us have. Indeed, for generations of architects, it's simply not possible to think of Columbia and not think of Ken. And well beyond Avery, I would like to offer the deepest gratitude for how he has lifted so many of us up. In a moment, I will leave Miodrag to his task, but if you would indulge me, just one brief reflection on one of Kenneth's many texts. In 1999, he delivered a beautiful lecture entitled Megaform as Urban Landscape as the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture at the University of Michigan School of Architecture. I've often returned to the publication of this talk for its content for sure, but also for the workmanlike quality of the argument. You can hear Ken grappling with the scale and the limits of architecture, particularly as the rapacious nature and consequences of human transformations of the natural environment come to define our new age. These questions have occupied my entire career, and as always, Ken was showing the way forward. Kenneth concludes that lecture with this. He writes, and I quote, "In an address in 1983, Vittorio Gregatti asserted that, quote, the origin of architecture is not the primitive hut, but the marking of ground to establish a cosmic order around the surrounding chaos of nature." Kenneth adds, "Now we have made a new nature, this technological, urbanized region, which is the new chaos. But as architects and as urbanists, we still have the same task," end quote. To me, this is Kenneth's design brief for the Anthropocene. It is my pleasure now to ask Miodrag to say a few words of introduction. Miodrag Mitrosinovic.
So, good evening. My name is Miodrag Mitrošinović. I'm a professor of urbanism and architecture here at Parsons School of Design at New School. And thank you, Joel, first of all. And again, a very distinct honor and a great pleasure to welcome Professor Kenneth Frampton to the New School. Let me also just do what is necessary, first of all, to thank the Tishman Environmental Design Center for organizing the lecture, and also everybody who has been involved in this project, I should say, because it has been actually taken a while for us to organize this, at least a year for this particular talk, and more than 15 years in actually talking about inviting Professor Frampton to come to do a lecture at Parsons. So it's been a while. But at least those who are involved in the last year's efforts, Cameron, Mike, Adrian, and others from the Tishman Center, thank you very much for all your kind efforts. I would like to offer a few introductory remarks, and let me just turn to the screen and then point to, we have three covers, obviously the 5th edition of Modern Architecture Critical History, Architecture in the Public World, Kenneth Frampton, a book edited by me within the book series called Radical Thinkers in Design, edited by Clive Dilnot and Eduardo Stasovsky, who are here in the audience. The book is in production and it will be coming out next year. I will say a little bit about it later. And then my absolutely favorite Kenneth Frampton book, the other Modern Movement, which came out by Yale University Press officially this summer, I believe, right? In August, yeah. So let me turn now to the remarks. I would like to situate, this is going to be about 12 minutes long, so don't expect me to finish in a minute because you may be disappointed, so bear with me. Two aspects to my introductory remarks. First, I would like to connect Kenneth Frampton to the New School via the work of Hannah Arendt, very briefly. And second, I would like to just make a few remarks on the title of tonight's lecture, which is the Reflections on the Limits of Architecture, Critical Regionalism Revisited. So the limits or the predicament of architecture, and on the other hand, of course, the theory of resistant architecture. So first, I will read just so that I make it more understandable to everyone, so bear with me. So firstly, as Kenneth Frampton habitually reveals himself, his scholarly work is deeply indebted to the work of Hannah Arendt, particularly the book The Human Condition of 1958, which to this day remains a formative influence. Frampton often observed that he shall, and I quote, never recover from this book, end quote, and that this book has actually shaped his, and again, quote, entire outlook on architecture, end quote. Frampton read Arendt in mid-60s, at the time when Arendt taught at the New School and Kenneth taught at Princeton University. In fact, this evening, thanks to Joel, I should say, this evening we are in the building designed by Joseph Urban, by those of you who don't know, and completed in 1930, in which Hannah Arendt taught between 1967 and 1971, before most of her teaching actually moved to at that time, the new graduate faculty building, which was on 65 Fifth Avenue, now demolished in order to make place for the new University Center. So it is in this period, during this time, that Frampton publishes his canonical early contributions. The first one in 1969, Labor, Work and Architecture, and then Industrialization and the Crisis of Architecture in 1973. These two essays, together with the On Reading Heidegger, which appeared in the 4th issue of Oppositions of 1974, a journal that Kenneth co-founded and co-edited, I believe, for 10 years following, provide us with phenomenological, political, or hermeneutical basis for Frampton's critical theory of building, as situated, in his own words, between the infrastructural and superstructural domains of human activity. In the words of Michael Hayes, this 1974 was the inaugural moment in which Frampton, and I quote, defined what we called contemporary architectural theory. Frampton's reading of Arendt's concepts, the public realm, the space of appearance, the public world, together with the distinction between labor, work, and action, contains an omnipresent urgency with which Frampton discusses architecture as a cultural discourse and a frame for life, as well as a political resource in the 20th and particularly also now in 21st century alike. Although Frampton is not, strictly speaking, and I think Kenneth will forgive me for saying this and writing it actually in the introduction of the book, Frampton is not, strictly speaking, an Arendtian scholar, and his interest was predominantly in the application of Arendtian political theory to architecture. I would suggest that his theoretical work follows deeper analogies to Arendt scholarship in at least two important aspects. First, in an essay titled Introduction into Politics, Arendt wrote in late 1950s, she asks, what is the meaning of politics? The answer, she says, is so simple and so conclusive that one might think all the other answers are utterly beside the point. The answer is, the meaning of politics is freedom. Extending on Arendt's thought, I would argue that the meaning of architecture in Kenneth Frampton's work is to configure and articulate the conditions of freedom by means of building. In his work, the Arendtian notion of freedom by means of politics has been expressed in shorthand through the concept of self-consciousness, autonomy, sovereignty, and liberty, all Frampton's terms from his writings that he identifies as key objectives for the architecture of resistance, while simultaneously arguing that architecture can be transformative, I quote, transformative, liberative, as well as resistant, all at the same time. Second, although Frampton's work suggests an ensemble of values for resistant architecture, as a non-formalist, he stays away from prescribing a normative architectural practice. Instead, in my view, his work offers, to reclaim the capacity for action by means of architecture. And this, to me, is really a key to, at least for my understanding of Frampton's work and contribution. And these two dimensions, I would submit, place Frampton squarely at the core of our Arendtian thesis, set him far apart from his contemporaries, and render his critical contributions truly inimitable. Indeed, Frampton stands without a peer as a true public intellectual, the most influential scholar of modern architecture and modern contemporary architecture, and one of the most published and cited scholars of all time, architectural scholars of all time. He has been a key figure in the evolution of the discipline of architecture over the past 60 years, and actually worldwide, through his extensive connections and teaching internationally and extensive travels and spreading of ideas literally worldwide. One of the key reasons, in my view, Frampton has occupied such a prominent position, not only in architecture, but also, very importantly, beyond the strict boundaries of the discipline, is that he never perceived architecture as a singularly materialistic, formalistic, or technical enterprise. For him, architecture is a broad human activity that relies equally on the most complex philosophical and theoretical ideas, as it does on connection to place, culture, landscape, and environment, and to the most grounded tactile and cognitive experiences articulated by the fact that it is ultimately constructed as a material presence in the world. If I find where I left this off, I would be able to continue very soon, but you can tell how unexcited I am since I lost the train of thought here. In his words, the full potential of a building, and I quote, stems from its capacity to articulate both the poetic and cognitive aspects of its substance, end quote, while simultaneously revealing the entanglements of the human condition with both politics and ethics. His rethinking of how architecture is interlaced with human condition, his conviction that architecture is both a cultural discourse and a frame for life, his highly syncretic scholarly work, and his passionate belief in the power of designing as a radically ethical pursuit. Such vision offers irreplaceable illumination to the eyes, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, to the eyes so used to darkness as ours. Frampton's left-of-center, that's his own term, left-of-center political ideas, and his explicit politicization of architectural history, criticism, and practice have maintained prominence because they illuminate the possibility of thinking and acting ethically and politically through and by means of architecture. The past decade, for those of you who have followed, as I did, the last 10 years have been extremely interesting also and noteworthy because of an incredible increase in the interest of Kenneth Frampton's work worldwide. First of all, an incredible book, The Festschrift from Frampton, edited by Carla Britton and Robert McCarter, was published recently, titled Modern Architecture in the Life World. In addition to edited volumes, monographs, dissertations, critical essays, interviews, documentary films, countless new and old public lectures posted to online platforms. Just go to YouTube and check it out for yourself. Social media posts and blogs, all concerned with Frampton's critical, historical, and theoretical work. In 2020, the Modern Architecture Critical History, first published in 1980, we will hear about it in a couple of moments, a little bit more, was reprinted in the enlarged 5th edition, which now includes a section 4, namely, a section with over 300 pages. It could have been a book on its own, 300 pages titled World Architecture and the Modern Movement. 3 years ago, Tom Avermaet and the group from Delft published an issue of OASI journal titled Critical Regionalism Revisited, in which a group of scholars gathered to revisit fundamental premises of Frampton's theory of critical regionalism. 2 years ago, Patius and Shachka's article, Critical Regionalism of Our Time, for Our Time, which revisits, reevaluates, and celebrates Frampton's 1983 essay Towards Critical Regionalism, 6 points for an architecture of resistance, became the Architectural Review's most read story of the year. Frampton's seminal Towards Critical Regionalism essay puts forth the idea that architecture which emerges through a consciously cultivated culture of place can deliberately evolve in direct opposition to the domination of hegemonic power as a form of resistance to the cumulative and totalizing working of universal technology, commodification, and environmental destruction. Frampton posits that the political emerges precisely in the confrontation between the universal civilization and rooted cultures. Frampton's recurring theme of predicament, which he has frequently employed in order to, and I quote, determine limits in order to do the work of quality, and which in that sense serve as his rhetorical device, as I guess tonight as well, to first identify and then allow for the transgression of such limits. Frampton recognizes and then unearths the limits as in a set of pressing themes, including the frequent focus on the relative autonomy of architecture, which is a theme that reemerges through his work basically from the very beginning. The necessity for philosophical reflection, environmental education, and the urgency of assuming an ecologically minded practice. The debate around participation, the urgent need to invest incremental urban strategies and to reassign significance to landscape, the demand for reassessment of the center-periphery dialectic, and the agonistic political future of architecture, of participatory democracy, and of the public realm. What underlies much of his work is the conviction that the Habermasian unfinished project of modernity still carries a unique emancipatory potential, capable of improving the lives of ordinary people through modern design. But also his recognition that the new millennium brings contemporary problems that cannot be addressed by the courses of action prescribed by the avant-garde modernism of the 20th century. Hence, Frampton suggests, if we are to recreate the public world, We urgently need new political and cultural imagination. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Kenneth Frampton to the stage.
Good evening. That was a little overwhelming, and it actually reminds me, while I don't pretend to the eloquence of John Ruskin, I'm reminded of Ruskin's vision of God, vision of death, actually, saying, it's an appropriate moment for me, saying that his idea is that, he likens God to when he was at rugby school, he was completely hopeless at cricket. And so he likens that incompetence on his part to the umpire, who he then identifies as the equivalent of God, coming to Ruskin and saying, "That'd be quite enough from you, Mr. Ruskin." And I sometimes feel that could be well applied to myself. Yeah, I mean, particularly after Miotrag's very, what can I say, very laudatory presentation. Okay, well, this is a bit premature. What am I doing here? I should go back, maybe. Am I going back or forward? No, let me go back. Yeah, right. Okay. Well, in fact, I've written this whole lecture, but I'm not going to read it because that's always a disaster. These are forward, following on the image that you saw earlier on the right of the 5th edition, which has become much fatter. Actually, the reason why it's become fatter is of some interest, which is that, yes, it really has to do with the publisher, with Thomas Neurath, who has, in fact, retired from directing the Thames and Hudson. Well, we both retired now in our different ways. And he constantly pushed me to add to the book over time, as he put it, in order to keep the book alive, from his point of view. And then at the last moment saying, I want you to expand the book to beyond the Eurocentric transatlantic kind of conversation to the preposterous idea of trying to map out architecture, worldwide. It follows on, actually, this 12-volume book that I was the general editor of, but not of all 12 volumes, but I was not the separate volume editor, which was on, it was called World Architecture, a Critical Mosaic, published by the China Architecture and Building Press at the turn of the century, but unfortunately, 2000, absolutely horrible distribution. I didn't quite know why they were unable to distribute the English version. There is also a Chinese version, but it's not as good. I mean, it's smaller and not as well printed, et cetera, et cetera. It was a beautiful production with separate, what happened was it's 1,000 buildings for 1,000 years for the century, and the world is kind of arbitrarily divided into 10 regions, and each region has a committee that selects 100 significant buildings for the entirety of the century under one particular sort of straw bus, so to speak, which in the case of, let's say, South Asia was Raoul Marotra, who, by the way, talking of public intellectuals, which brings me back to Joel Towers, combines in an incredible way the role of being both a public intellectual and an architect. I mean, he is an astonishing figure who ought, in my view, to be better known both as an architect and as a public intellectual. He presently professor of urban design at Harvard, but constantly going, I don't know where the energy comes from, between Boston and Mumbai in order to maintain an architectural practice in India. But what you're looking at here, and I suppose you're getting impatient waiting me to say something about it, is the 4 successive covers of this book, which was first published in 1980, and 1980, 1985, the important second edition from the point of view of this evening's talk anyway, and 1992, and then 2007, and then much more recently, of course, 2020, the 5th edition, which is twice the size of any previous editions. It no longer is a convenient pocketbook, in other words. It's become altogether too monumental. But I suppose it has its own, I don't know what, merits. Anyway, it has a merit in that it succeeds to, I think it does do that, to escape this kind of rather closed conversation, very Occidental conversation between Europe on the one hand and the States on the other. I mean, the transatlantic, Eurocentric view of the world. It really tries to escape from that. So that was one thing I wanted to say about this long surviving and never kind of, I think probably I have, we've seen the last edition with the 5th edition, I'm absolutely sure of that, but anyway, this is the story, and I thought I would begin there. Okay. Then I wanted to talk about, exactly the moment when the first edition of the book was published, 1980, coincided in a very ironic and maybe slightly disturbing way with the advent of the Venice Biennale of that year, which was the first stylistic postmodern biennale. And, they had this famous, keep on doing the wrong thing here. All right. It had this famous Strada Novissima lined with kind of decorative shop fronts by rising architects of the moment, and the so-called New Street, and of course very inspired in a way by, ultimately, by Robert Venturi's 1966 book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which, in which he formulates for the first time the idea of reducing architecture. I think it's very much a reductive project, to a decorated shed, intrinsically scenographic, which, and of course closely linked to the modern experience of publicity. And that's the main objection, of course, I had to the Biennale. I mean, that it reduced architecture, repeatedly to nothing more than a sort of mise en scène. And so I resigned from that. Robert Stern invited me to be part of that commission, and I duly resigned from the committee when I realized the direction it was going in. And this led me eventually in 1983 to publish this text, Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, which was published in Hal Foster's The Anti-Aesthetic, which was subtitled Essays in Postmodern Culture. And of course, I've had to realize, well, it should have been obvious from the beginning, that this essay in itself, Towards a Critical Regionalism, was, of course, postmodern by definition. The situation, of course, was and still is, of course, fundamentally postmodern. And what do we really mean by that term, postmodern? That's a big question. And I think it's fair to say that between the two world wars, there was the idea in modern architecture, but not only in modern architecture, that built on the 19th century concept of progress, and you perhaps could even say 18th and 19th century concept of progress, the idea of modernity in particular, and of the modern movement in architecture, was inseparable in the end from socialism, basically, I think, despite the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright would turn over in his grave if I identify him as a socialist, but the movement in general, particularly the European movement, was very, I think, integral with the socialist project, with the idea of modernization as a socialist undertaking. And I was going to say that, yes, one of the embarrassing things is that in making the 5th edition, I not only did I had the opportunity to expand the coverage to a much wider world view, but also to recover certain sort of lacunae in the story, so to speak. And one of the big missing aspects on my part was not to recognize the absolute fundamental importance of the exhibition that was held in Stockholm in the year that this building was completed, 1930, which also, as a matter of fact, happens to be the year I was born, so a number of things are coming together. But Stockholm 1930 was clearly an overt statement about the project, you know, the modern project, Habermas's modern project, which Mickey has already referred to. And yeah, it was a project in a sense, you know, to create a kind of egalitarian, universal middle class environmental culture. I think one could put it like that, you know, and so that was its aim, and so it says everything, I think, about what was the modern project between the two world wars. And also it says a lot about my own nostalgia for the modern project between the two world wars. So in fact, when Modern Architectural Critical History is first published, it's published with the kind of very naive intent, I think, that somehow or other it's still possible to continue with the modern project, you know, the Habermas's unfinished modern project. And in that sense, of course, it was very influenced by Banham's book that came out 20 years before, in 1960, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, which ends up, the apotheosis of the Banham's version of the story is to culminate in the work of Buckminster Fuller, which is to culminate, of course, in technology. And you can say that in some sense, you know, the whole famous Anglo-Italian school of high-tech architecture that I suppose emerged into its first public evidence with the Centre Pompidou that was designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers in 1972, that this endeavor and trajectory, which would last really from 72 to the end of the century. Well, in fact, Piano is still, of course, very active. And so, for that matter, is Foster, though not always so quite so successfully as he was in an earlier period of his career. I'm thinking of this monster that's being built in Manhattan, ostensibly by his office. It's a pretty sad story. Anyway, you know, it's clear that the Banham book ends with this aspiration, you know, the kind of famous Buckminster Fuller thing. He would always challenge architects by saying, well, most architects don't know how much their buildings weigh, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this kind of technical reduction, basically, you know, of what building culture has to offer to human society and to human life. And this is where Banham ends up. And in fact, I think he never completely escapes from that position. Although he comes to the West Coast, of course, he writes his famous book on the well-tempered environment and so on. But he remains committed to an American vision, but perhaps not so obsessively technological as he would be in 1960 at the end of that particular historical account. And I would, you know, I was extremely influenced by Banham, in fact. but I end the account rather differently. Even then, in 1980, I end it with the way in which the proliferation of media, photography in particular, and high-speed photography, etc., in effect undermines the presence of architecture. Its phenomenological presence is really undermined directly by the media, and that still goes on. Of course, it is very much. It was very much what was going on in 1980 in the Venice Biennale, because in a way this whole new street running down the Arsenale in the Biennale was very much a scenographic and also a mediatic photographic event, mainly, of course, highly influential from a photographic standpoint. But my entry into critical regionalism, which is a term coined by Alexonis and Liane Lefebvre, a Greek, and I think she's of Belgian origin, an essay that they wrote in 1981, which appeared in a journal called Architecture in Greece, and in which they coined the term critical regionalism for the first time. And this essay of theirs is focused on, it's actually an introduction to a younger generation, to the practice of Dimitri and Susanna Antonakakis, the so-called Studio 66. But in so doing, it's discussing the two leading architects in Greece of the 50s, that is Dimitri Pikionis and Aris Konstantinidis. And we're looking here at Aris Konstantinidis' archaeological museum in Yanina in Greece, which is also, as it happens, completed in '66. The same date, incidentally, just for passing observation, as Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction. And in this dialogical essay of theirs, in which they coined the term critical regionalism, they compare the grid of Konstantinidis, the rationalist grid of Konstantinidis, of course, to the pathway of Pikionis. And by the pathway of Pikionis, they mean this. This is its plan, of course. One doesn't know quite. Well, the drawing even suggests that it's not exactly, that the beginning and end of this undertaking is not exactly completely self-evident. And but in effect, of course, it is this. And I first saw this. It's on Philopappou Hill outside the Acropolis. I first saw this in 1959, and I was extremely impressed by it. And I was returning from Israel, in fact, to the UK. And when I got to London, I talked with considerable enthusiasm to my Greek colleagues that I knew at the time there about this promenade park staging ground of Dimitri Pikionis. And they sort of they couldn't really understand what was the cause of my enthusiasm. And the main cause, of course, was the fact that this was not just a visual work. Well, there were many aspects to it. It was not just a visual work. It was made out of spolia, and in many cases, I think, I'm not sure about this, made out of demolished neoclassical Athenian houses, which had been built, at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century as part and parcel of the movement of Greek national independence. And by this date, of course, by 59, had gone out of fashion. And they were being demolished, I think, at quite a rate. In any case, I think some of this stuff that was used by Pikionis to make this park, which, by the way, he only finished just before I happened to arrive. I mean, it's not as though he was there, but he was still working. He didn't complete the project until 59, in fact. And what is, of course, so remarkable about this project, and perhaps it's very familiar to you, is it is extremely tactile. I mean, it cannot just be appreciated by the eyes. It is, in fact, spontaneously appreciated by the body, phenomenologically appreciated by the body, by the movement, by the gait, by the experience of the body in negotiating the site. And of course, that negotiation of the site in relation to the antique Acropolis, Parthenon, Erechtheion, etc., and also to the landscape, Lycabettus Hill, the landscape around Athens. And which brings one finally to this work, which is this little pavilion come restaurant, which is timber framed, as indeed is the gateway here, using a language which he will use in a children's play ground in Kifisia, using a language which, when you look at this, I think you get it, you know. On the one hand, of course, the trabeated, it's a very carefully posed photograph, I think by Helene Binet, but I'm not completely sure. Some of these are by Helene Binet. And of course, when I was looking at the Parthenon on the Acropolis, you know, there is obviously the photographer has made this juxtaposition between this lightweight timber structure and the Parthenon. But the complexity of this work already introduces, you know, this odd creativity which involves a kind of perhaps only half-conscious miscegenation of traditions, so to speak, you know, where an existing tradition or a failing tradition is revitalized by a tradition which is taken from outside of the tradition. You know, I have in mind, of course, the rather obvious things about Greek sculpture being ultimately dependent upon Egyptian sculpture or Japanese architecture, which this, by the way, is alluding to, being, of course, dependent on China. So that this then is the primary opposition between, as spelt out by Zonis and Lefebvre in the grid and the pathway, between the rationality of the grid and the topography of the pathway. But here in 1976, which is, yes, a long time later, shortly before his death, I think, Aris Konstantinidis publishes his book, Elements for Self-Knowledge, which is a series of his beautiful photographs of Greek vernacular, interspersed with citations from Greek poets, actually. So this book, well, what's interesting about this is a typical, well, it's this beautiful shot of this fence, you know, agricultural fence, but made of stone. You know, extraordinary, I think. And, or this old house, of course, probably a farmhouse in a state of decay, or this wall, you know, two walls, in fact, dividing with a kind of strange, rather challenging road in between them, very topographic. The reason why, and this extraordinary thing, which are these incredible chairs, which are, you know, totally anonymous, produced by cabinet makers in the street, you know, still, I suppose, being produced there, maybe, I hope, with straw seats, etc. And then just this flimsy structure, you know, covering a place to eat by the sea. These photographs of Konstantinidis make one realize how, although these two figures were opposed to each other in terms of their formation, in fact, they'd both been educated in Germany, but rather differently. Piccionis was rather close at one point to De Chirico, one wouldn't be surprised to know. And also at some point, of course, Piccionis was also a very rationalist white architect, but not in this period. And also, well, that's also the strange thing. Konstantinidis, who was younger, was never, ever quite a a white rationalist architect. And we see here a holiday house in Sikia near Corinth in Greece, which is made from a reinforced concrete frame, of course, but with rubble stone infill walls. And you see the plan of these bedrooms and the dining room at the bottom and the living space. Very small house with a small bathroom at the end, the smallest volume, in fact, on this kind of paved surface. But what is fascinating, I think, is the way the concrete is used here, because it's used in two different ways. I mean, very precisely in one case with the frame, the frame that's going to be left open and receive wood, and in the other case, more roughly delineated, still continuing the same frame, but very, very roughly cast. So that here, of course, you have if ever, there is a tactile statement right here, It's not just a visual statement, and that is true of the whole house, I think. And then you see these more precise castings receive, as I already said, timber fenestration, rather sophisticated timber fenestration, etc. More of the same, actually beautifully detailed, extraordinary. And we'll see detailing like that again in a minute. And by the way, this reminds me of something, because Joel Towers is too modest to ever say this, and maybe he would even be embarrassed by it. But I first got to know him well when he was in partnership with Carla Rothstein, and they had designed this house. And I would remember being with them very intensely, talking about the house. And I remember that being very impressed by Joel Towers' command of what it was to build something, what it was to detail and build something. I mean, so despite the fact that he's become a generic intellectual who's interested in bigger issues, he carries this secret skill inside him, One day maybe it will just break out. But anyway, this is the second edition in French. It's rather ridiculous. I don't have copies of everything, I'm afraid to say, but I do have this in French. It's the second edition. And it's 1985. And it's the first edition in which I try to expand on the idea of critical regionalism. And so you see here, this is chapter 5, so it's one more chapter added to the book in order to keep it alive, Thomas Neurath's desire. And there's the thesis of the 1983 essay is kind of repeated here, but I cite examples which in fact, there was only one illustration included in the 1983 essay, which was, in fact, of this church of Jorn Utzon at the top right here, Bergsvei Church, 1976. And, this is a fascinating building because, it's after he returns very depressed from Australia because basically they've taken over finishing the Opera House and he has been fired. And he designs this building in a suburb outside Copenhagen, which I think in a way is more resolved actually than the Sydney Opera House, much more resolved, not as ambitious, not as large. It's a smaller work. And it has, there's all sorts of, this is I suppose the point I'm trying to get at when I allude to the limit of architecture. I'm alluding to the nuances that can be built into a work of architecture, which, unless you really cultivate students and educate them so that they understand what it's capable of, this field. I mean, therefore, in a non-reductive way, by going back over tradition, not only the modern tradition, but also other traditions, and also not only the Western tradition, but also other traditions. And this is particularly pertinent to the work of Hudson because when he worked on the Sydney Opera, well, there's also a very interesting issue here, which is the very weird preoccupation with Chinese culture altogether on the part of the Danes. There are many historians and theorists and whatnot, who have, it's a long kind of tradition also in Denmark, this presence of China, presumably because of trade, but it's also other people traded with China, but why Denmark? I don't know the answer. But this, when he worked on the Sydney Opera House, Hudson had in his office a Song Dynasty building manual called the Ying Sao Fa Shi, which was just simply there as a kind of fetish object, He managed to purchase, rather valuable, rare book, but the point of the book was just its symbolic presence. This is the office that would supervise the construction of the Sydney Opera House. And here, and it's hard to totally prove the case, that these folded plate curvilinear vaults that cover, of course, the nave, but also a little chapel to the right in front, and also then the confirmation and the priest robing area behind the nave. This is reinforced concrete in situ vaults. Not a rational way from an economical point of view, from a technological point of view, fuller, of spanning across the nave, because you could do it much cheaper with metal, etc., etc. No, the use of in situ reinforced concrete in a building that's made entirely of concrete, by the way, either precast or in situ, both, in fact, equally. And I'll show you some more images very briefly at the end. This combination, which is articulated between the aisles, very compressed, and the nave, very wide, the aisles covered with patent greenhouse glazing. It is a sort of building system that takes a pleasure in the realization of the building system, but also in the articulation of the system so that the cultural density of the work, with references that are not only Occidental, but also Oriental. Occidental, i.e. references to traditional Nordic stave churches, and Oriental references to pagoda, Chinese curved roof forms, etc., etc. So this is the one image that was in the 1983 manifesto, if you like, these 6 points for architectural resistance, and it appears again here as I begin to assemble buildings which I think do exemplify this idea of critical regionalism. So this is actually Alvaro Ziza's beerish house in Povoa do Varzim, almost the same date as Hudson's Bargsvai Church, 73 to 77. And you see, there are curious things about it. Well, many curious things. First of all, the boys in the office called it the bomb house because it looks as though it, had been a kind of cubistic work which somebody had put a bomb into, blowing out this kind of patio, this, you could say it's in some sense, very irrational patio. And somehow I'm reminded of an ironic remark by Carlo Imanino looking at the Centre Pompidou in Paris and saying in French, c'est comme toute l'architecture, c'est-à-dire de rendre le facile à travers inutile. Now, so got it wrong. De rendre le facile difficile à travers inutile. It's a great play on words. And, to make the easy difficult by way of the useless, And of course, you could very critically say this about this beerish house. Why exactly to do this? What is the cultural significance of this? And one of the aspects of it, I think, And this brings me now to something I've only recently discovered. And somehow, you know, one is always trying to catch up with oneself, in fact, you know, because I knew very well someone who died very young, Ignasi de Solomorales, who was a very brilliant Catalan critic, and who wrote in 1987 an essay with the title "Weak Architecture," and this idea of weak architecture was borrowed directly from Gianni Vattimo's book La fine della modernità, which is the end of modernity, that first appeared in Italian in 1985. So Ignasi must have read it and then tried to take the idea of weak thought with which this idea of the end of modernity was associated and apply it to architecture, weak architecture. And in essence, by weak architecture, he means an architecture which recognizes that the modern project cannot be continued, that the modern project between the two world wars, the socialist modern project, is not possible anymore. And that what is possible is a kind of re-examination of the syntax of this project, but always recognizing that it is not achievable. In other words, it's a kind of self-conscious, yes. It's of course postmodern. It is postmodernity itself. And I was thinking, as Joel and Miodrag were talking, you know, about the way modernization totally overwhelms us. You know, this is the world we are living in. This technosphere has so escaped our control that we literally, you can see it, of course, climate change is the absolute concrete manifestation that we are no longer in control of this technosphere. And we still go on with it, of course. We still also have the myth of progress, which sort of supports this idea that the new must always be better than the thing before, etc., etc. This, yeah. And this, I think, is of course, Ziza doesn't say any of this directly, but I think this house is very much, you know, it is a kind of, in a sense, a kind of play, ludic, playful. It is a work to be lived in. It's actually, I think, rather comfortable house. Courtyard house, almost a double courtyard house because the garden is enclosed by a wall, but then the little, the kind of bomb crater also encloses a smaller garden. This work also involves tradition, you know, this is another version of the same book, which shows, you see, the elevations and the plans and the sections of the house. And this shows you the courtyard and its, the pleasurable aspect of this courtyard. And it shows you these very delicate windows, which are, by the way, the combination of sash and casement windows. And how did sash windows, which are very much a British invention, end up in Porto, in Portugal? Well, I think because of trade, because you know, shipping windows to Portugal as ballast for ships and bringing back port and sherry for the English, who are sort of always poised on being nationally as alcoholic as the Scandinavians, and never admitting it, of course. But so that these sessions, this is, of course, there's nothing written. This is, you won't find this in any textbook. It's entirely a speculation on my part, but it is still very strange and very perverse, of course, in a way, to combine sash windows with casement windows. But this is what Alvaro does in the exuberance of that early moment, 76. And here you see these details of these, because that's a big shock for me. I thought these windows were of steel. But then I realized, later of course, going there, that they're of wood. And they are, and of course, no one could, this could not be done anymore because carpenters able to work at that level of skill and also be paid not enough, of course, for that level of skill, no longer are applying their trade, not even in Portugal, I don't think. So, and what is amazing is Ziza's command over what it is to build in what is carpentry exactly? What is it exactly? This is a real command, I think. And in the same house, you get this in the kitchen, horizontal steel windows, fixed, right? So, in a sense, the fenestration is not just one reference; it's making, in a way, multiple references to different moments in time, in fact, in the same building. And finally, you come to this, upper living floor. And of course, I think of it as being critically regional, but the astonishing thing about it is not only these casement and sliding windows, also, of course, the filtering of the light, the fact that the sliding partitions go out to touch the wall, for example, the way the space is occupied, the light in the space. I mean, this is very much, I think, a sort of regional expression, and it is the light above all, perhaps, and it is not in any way sentimental. And I want to pass to one other work by him, which is also equally small, this kind of slightly awkward across the spread, of course, hence the gutter is showing. But this is kind of panoramic photograph of an old vintner's house and vineyard. And these granite poles here that are sort of in the process of falling over are holding loggias which have vines on them still. And what's amazing, or what was amazing for me, is that these poles, pillars in fact, square sectioned roughly, are cut out of granite, extraordinary thing to do. I mean, in terms of the treatment of granite anyway, but of course, I suppose the decision was made that these granite poles would never deteriorate. And so this shows the plan. The old house is shown in black here. What Ziza adds to it is this bedroom wing, with 4 bedrooms, bathroom, etc. And you see in the section that the old house is sort of being partly converted and is higher than the new addition, It's a real effort is made to keep the new addition low, to actually sink it into the ground in order that it does not compete with the old house. So this, I think, also could pass as an example of weak architecture in this sort of Ignacio de Soler Morales essay. And which brings me back to Utzon and to the Bergswald Church, and leads me to emphasize again the fact that the aisles of the church are covered in this patent glazing, and that there is a basement to this church. And in fact, what one gets here is a kind of earthwork, the basement, with the roof work on top, which is very much the Zemperian 4 elements of architecture, this opposition between the earthwork podium and the roof work and the membrane enclosing the building, which I won't go into, but of course I have played around in this area with the 1992 book of mine, which bears the title Studies in Tectonic Culture. But one sees how the curves of the vaults, were determined by this play with circles. You know. And here we see the outside of the building, and we see, you know, this play of plank concrete versus concrete blocks. And I think you can make it out from this image that the line of the concrete blocks is stepping upwards and downwards, corresponding to the curved movement of the vaults inside. I mean, these concrete blocks do not touch the vaults inside because the vaults inside are taking their bearing off the inner line of the structure and not off this outer line. But this play between concrete planks, precast, and concrete blocks, precast, you know, within the overall concrete frame, is making a reference to what is within. And then there are other things which could lead one to classify this as also being an example of weak architecture, because well, two things on my mind. Well, actually, I need to go back to this image just briefly. Yes, I forgot to mention that this bedroom addition to this house was commissioned by a banker, not too surprising. And his colleagues told him, listen, you have to get rid of all these old vines and plant orange trees, so that, you know, which are much more easy to, no maintenance practically, and they're much more profitable and they're easy to maintain, and you don't really have to do anything. And the architect had to spend his time persuading the client not to do that, you know. And here I think this also could qualify as an aspect of weak architecture, you know, that the architect not only designs the work, but also goes beyond into looking after the work in a deeper, older cultural sense. And why I was reminded of this is because in this Bargsby church, these trees which now surround the church were planted by the architect and his sons gratis, you know, because there was no trees in the original design. There was the greensward, but no trees. And these trees, which are now mature birch trees, you know, flank this extraordinary building on both sides. You know, so the concrete walls of the building are red against and through black and white silver birch trees. And here you see, I think, another aspect of the work, which brings us to another aspect of modernization, and brings us back to what has been called weak thought by the philosopher himself, I think, Pensieri deboli, and the end of modernity and secularization. Because what he argues, this is a very broad summation, that modernization, which had at one time been driven by the idea of progress and still is rhetorically driven by that notion, is actually very heavily disrupted by secularization. And in other words, there is no end. You know, it is, of course, the Nietzschean death of God and all that business. You know, there is no overarching raison d'être. You know, and so the modern movement at one point, with inseparable from socialism, had an overarching raison d'être, and that also has been lost. You know, in that you can say that this socialist project, the unfinished modern project, remains unfinished. That's all, in fact, pathologically unfinished, you could say, given you know the fact that in the richest country in the world, kids are starving, I mean, you know, all the rest of it, with a maldistribution of wealth that's out of sight, you know. The modernization process is not going in a very convincing direction, I think. And so vis-a-vis secularization, one of the problems, of course, eternal problem for a modern architect, for the skepticism of modernity, is how to design a religious building. And here, you know, one of the, is my opinion, one of the stratagems, yes, used by Hudson is to almost make it a metaphorical agricultural building, you know, almost to render it as a barn, you know. And I think that there's a way of escaping, you know, from the sort of fatality of kitsch. And this brings me to my last images, you'll be happy to hear. Yes, and the fact that I've not so far read any of this document, which I've seen. Maybe there's one little quote that's worth indulging in. This is Alvaro Siza, I'm not quite sure of the date, but I think it's also the mid-70s, where he's talking about, you know, most of his works were not realized. It's the earlier point in his career, and many were changed and left incomplete. And but then he evokes, the essay is called "The Flittering Image of Reality," and there's just a short quote from this. Each design must capture with the utmost rigor a precise moment of the flittering image in all its shades, and the better you can recognize that flittering quality of reality, the clearer your design will be. This may be why marginal works have been kept as they were originally designed, but something remains. Pieces are kept here and there, fathered by someone, leaving marks on space and people, melting into a process of total transformation. This is Siza. And it's the same Siza, by the way, who I have here. Another quote, because he's just great. Another quote from Siza, which is, yes, where the hell is that exactly? No, I've lost it. Well, he says, yes, I can remember it by heart anyway. I tell them, the university authorities, that an architect is a specialist in the non-specialization, but they can't take that, not even as a joke. And this is this very witty, wise guy. Okay, and also a witty, wise guy who, you know, for a long time under Salazar, it was not possible to travel abroad. But with the fall of Franco, et cetera, and the fall of Iberian fascism altogether, it was possible to travel. And when they could travel, Alvaro was a student and was taken by Fernando Tavera, who was his master and head of the school, to Finland. That was the first place to go to, was Finland. And it's clear that Aalto is a fundamental spirit behind his work. It's surely a repetition différente. But anyway, here we are with San Laszlo City Hall, with a series of images taken by a very close friend of mine who recently was there. His name is Brendan Woods, lives in London, and is trying to write a book on Patrick Hodgkinson, who worked for Aalto and also was very influenced by Aalto. So here we have this little town hall, San Laszlo Town Hall. It was a competition entry in 1948. Very few drawings, but nonetheless he won, and was finished in 52. And was in the way the beginning of the city, starting to build a little town, town, with a town hall. And in fact, as far as I can see, I'm not completely sure of this, that this town never really fully came into being as a town. So in a sense, this is also weak architecture in another sense, in that the project was never fully realized, you know. And despite the fact, of course, of this architect in particular and the patronage of the very powerful Finnish timber industry was able to complete a lot, they were not able to complete this. But the town hall in itself was completed. It consisted of a town hall plus shops on the ground floor. You can see that these shops have been boarded up, you know, no longer functioning. The town hall is still there. I think it's no longer used as a town hall, but it's somehow preserved. You can stay in it, not in the council chamber, but in the ancillary buildings. And this is what Brendan Woods was doing when he took this photograph. And the reason I'm ending with it is the fact that it's, of course, very beautifully built, that it is a Poetics of Construction, that this is standard standing seam metal roofs on the lower buildings. You can see the plan of the little council chamber with the stair leading up. And in fact, in the image on the, I suppose I might, I have to, a bit late to discover this, but anyway, this actually is the main entrance, and there's a staircase there that is rising up to the council chamber. And so there's a central kind of raised level which has a kind of rough mound going up into it, like also an earthwork. And the library on this side and the caretaker's suite on the other side. And but you know what I think is brilliant in this piece is the fact that this monumental staircase, with its very beautifully detailed steel handrail, and the pergola beyond, connecting the town hall to the library, this monumental staircase, you know, it's granite, of course, and it's handled, you know, within the classical syntax in order to produce a civic staircase, you know, a kind of monument linking the lower level to the level of entry into the council chamber. And you see it much better here, perhaps, you know. These tiles also were a kind of revetment going around the shops at grade. And you see the way the whole granite piece is set in to the brickwork, and the pergola runs across. Well, more of the same. And then you enter into this, the council chamber, you know, which is lined in brick and has brick walls, but also this fugal relationship between the brick and the wood, you know. Of course, the planting is part of this story. And then there is this staircase which leads you up to the council chamber. And this, of course, is an extremely tactile experience, because as you climb these bricks, treads, you know, you can feel the friction of the treads against your bodily weight, you know. So again, you are experiencing it not just visually, but also in terms of your, phenomenologically, in terms of touch. Well, of course, you're touching the handrail, but also in terms of your feet. And of course, light. Light participates in this experience, as you see it here at the end of the system, before you enter the council chamber. And it's hard to represent this, but you come off the brick staircase onto a boarded council chamber floor, like this floor, but springy, unlike this floor. So it slightly moves, unlike the brick, which doesn't move at all. It slightly gives under your weight. And also it's very, unlike the brick, it's slightly slippery, so that the body has to readjust to the negotiation of the floor. And then with above, there are these two trusses which pick up all the purlins of the monopitch roof outside. And this thing is getting me to hurry up by itself, Just get on with it. Well, you can see the same, yes. The same craftsmanship is used everywhere. And this is, this is the visitor's balcony overlooking the council chamber. And here you see the trusses again. The trusses. It's clear that they make a reference to medieval building culture, where the actual roof structure is, this thing has a life of its own. The roof structure is an honorific structure. It's just as honorific in relation to medieval construction as the granite stairs entering the building are honorific in relation to the classical tradition, let's say. So here, there's a definite, as in much of his work, conscious mixing of traditions, Okay, so this is my last image, and shows the thing in the middle of winter. I don't have too much more to say about it, but also perhaps it will also qualify as an example of weak architecture. I realize, of course, one always realizes this with horror, that one doesn't really have a conclusion, There is no conclusion. But in the taxi coming here, I jotted down something that could sort of maybe get by as something in lieu of a conclusion. Yeah, so, yes, I suppose the first thing I thought, and I've already said it, this kind of fact that in some sense, Sanaslo is the most amazing example of the presence of architecture and of an astonishing kind of cultural richness that I think can be pointed to in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of living experience, corporeal experience. And then the fact that it did fail, it's finished in 52, and this reminded me of a remark made, which actually I've never completely got to the bottom of. It was shown on a panel in the Museum of Modern Art, and I talked to Barry Bergdahl about it, but we never quite tracked its source. Because Mies gives an interview in 51, the same year, more or less the same year as Sanaslo, in Chicago, having been in the States for 14 years. And somewhere he says, that is why we can't build cities anymore. Old cities, planned cities. It goes on like a forest. He's referring, of course, to the megalopolis, that is everywhere. Already there, 1951. The automobile and the megalopolis. One leads directly to the other. And he says, yes, we can't build cities anymore, and we will have to learn how to live in the jungle and even do well by that. This is Mies, 1951. So, on the one hand, you have Aalto in Finland, 52, making a remarkable work that promises the creation of a town, unlike the British new towns, beginning with the town hall. And then you have Mies in Chicago, very far away, reflecting on the impossibility of building towns, And yes, so what I have kind of obsessively labored throughout this lecture is a kind of critique of the present state of schools of architecture, where, we simply seem to lack all capacity to talk about architecture, qua architecture, because, the entire space is taken up by anxiety justifiable anxiety about racial and social injustice and the maldistribution of wealth and climate change, etc., etc. You know, as though architecture, qua architecture, can do anything about any of that. You know, of course, one can design more sustainable buildings, etc., etc. More buildings that are more able to withstand intense climate change and also to mediate changes in climate, etc., etc. That, of course, can be done as part. There's no contradiction between that and what I've attempted to emphasize. But yes, but there's no doubt that, in my opinion, that you know, modernization is completely, you know, we're no longer in control of modernization, and the consequences of it is quite, quite a challenge, I think, and so there is no conclusion. I mean, except that, of course, all of this discourse about a weak architecture is really emphasizing the fact that most students are. This is a challenge, really, which I think we don't seem to be able to do, you know, which is how to combine training people with sufficient competence to know how to build and how to, therefore, detail buildings, etc., at least as at the beginning stage, so to speak, you know. And to do it also with a sort of cultural intelligence, we seem not to be able to do that. And we are perhaps not doing such a good job either at the level of cultural education, you know. I mean, I think that architectural schools are in a very sort of difficult position at this moment, and are trying in a way to compensate for the disorder of the society, you know, within the House of Architecture. I mean, this is just not possible. You can't overcome this disorder through something so limited as architecture. And then the other thing, I think, which is very important, is that most students who graduate from these schools at best will make small buildings, you know. And that's what they should be taught respect for, you know. Small worlds that will enable human subject to survive, to continue, you know, in a very difficult moment of time. Thank you.
Okay, this works. So let's open it up for questions. We have the time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Ken, thank you.
I want to make a statement. This is a green statement that you made. My reaction.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have my voice kind of carries on, but hi, Ken.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, hi.
This is very grim.
Yeah, well, you know.
Is it kind of little light of hope?
Yeah, of course there is. Well, in the weak architecture, there's hope.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, one has to recognize limits of architecture. You know, the big project is not possible for architecture. I mean, we have all these departments of urban design and planning and God knows what. I mean, who's kidding who? What planning? There is no planning. Oh, you know, ridiculous. There is no planning, basically. You know, real estate speculation,
Yeah.
it controls everything. Does it not? Isn't it a fact? I mean, look at this city. No one has an idea what this city is anymore. Just the developer can do what he likes. You know, there's no concept at all. You know, I mean, it's a staring, glaring fact. Well, why should we deny it? But we do, of course, academically, we go on, as though, well, it's still possible. I remember Zoltan in Harvard in the 60s saying, at one of these conferences about urbanism, what would happen to surgery if it were never practiced? He's right, of course, totally right.
Well, if I might add something. I remember when I was in Minneapolis in 1967 doing a master's program and working on the so-called experimental city. In those years, there was such a technical, how can I say, push or dream. I mean, people really thought that they would change the world. Becky Fuller was involved in that project. And there was some hope. Whether or not, and that was in a university setup, and there was some hope, and well, I was glad to be part of it. And it came to nothing, with the Josic Dome and all these things is past.
Yeah.
And
but you don't disagree with me then?
Well, I had a good time in '67. I mean,
what?
At least I had a good time.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I'm not.
I had a time of hope. I mean, I was hoping that, something, well, for the best of humankind will happen. I really, truly believed it.
But that's the point about this kind of slightly strange idea of weak architecture, is the possibility of creating small worlds, that can sustain human life, even that is a challenge, and particularly if we don't train people, with some idea of, how to do that, for example. I mean, what I think is amazing is the first year of a school, graduate school of architecture, where no one would be so unsophisticated as to give a house for students to design. I mean, what a funny idea. I mean, it's such an outrage. It's just not difficult to believe. One has to give much more complicated propositions, where in many instances there's no decent solution to them. And I mean, this question of architecture schools, I think there is a crisis in architectural education. Maybe I'm wrong, but I do.
Hello. Thank you for your entertaining and depressing talk. I don't want to audibly agree with your critique of academia because I have faculty here that I really love. But in my generation, let's say, as I am an architecture student as well, what would you recommend us do then outside of school? Let's say, how can we, as students, take action and let's say not create weak architecture?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are different aspects. I mean, there is one's life as a professional, I suppose, and then there is one's political life. I mean, I think this political issue, on an individual basis, there is a kind of responsibility in that regard, I think, But, I mean, very difficult to make it count also when you think of the situation right now in the United States vis-a-vis democracy. It's a little bit kind of precarious. It's not that easy, of course. I recognize that. And one of the things I omitted to say, looking at the Alto Town Hall, is that this is I forgot to say that. You know, this is the Hannah Arendt space of appearance, space of public appearance. I mean, she makes this argument that literally this space, physical space, is a quintessence of the democratic, you know, and that and actually, strange enough, in Glarus in Switzerland, there is a canton which still holds assemblies in a public square where people have been informed about the various legislations that are under consideration, and they take a hand vote, you know, still in Glarus. I think it's the only canton that still does that. But, you know, this is the space of public appearance in the Arendtian sense, and this is why Hannah Arendt was always thought of the workers' councils formed after the revolution, Russian Revolution. The Soviets, in fact, the original Soviets, as you know, the ultimate democratic, in other words, something closer to direct democracy. And that's why I think, you know, beginning with the town hall, and I didn't articulate that very well at all, is to begin with the idea of the public realm, of the political space of appearance, also cultural space of appearance, but also political. Town hall, library together, you know, is important, makes the building particularly significant, I think, and also brings up the issue of decentralized governance and what used to be, in terms of cities, you know, decentralized decision making. You know. And you can say, of course, there is an echo of this in the United States, in the fact that the states themselves are capable of decentralized decision-making, etc., which is surely the case, but has been the case. But, you know, it's clear that even this ground, i.e. democracy, is a little fragile, you know. And so, you know, well, okay, what can an architectural student do? Well, I think this question of creating small worlds is really important, you know. It's also important for communities as well. You know, I think the building of libraries, the building of schools, the building of housing, the creation of landscapes, by the way, because I think landscape is of ever-increasing importance in the current situation in terms of being able to mediate in any way the megalopolitan chaos by which we are sort of surrounded, more or less, you know. I mean, once you leave Manhattan as a walled city, you know, the only walled city, walled by water, remaining in the North American continent, I mean, then you're in the megalopolis, you know. You're in New Jersey, of course. All right. Yes, another. I know, not a very good answer, but I mean, what else? I don't know what to say beyond that.
How's it going? My name is Jordan. I just had a question, maybe two. What do you think about a building that's worth analyzing in the last 10 years? And then what's a building that's not worth analyzing? What do you think is a bad building in the last 10 years? And then the second is really quick. What do you think of the line in Saudi Arabia that's going to be built? Part? The line, it's a structure that's going through in Saudi Arabia.
I don't know much about it. I've only just heard about it, right? It's by Big, isn't it? Designed by this Danish firm? No?
James.
I don't know. I thought it was.
Well, we could talk about that next time, maybe.
No, I don't know.
So, not to throw you off.
Well, you know, from the point of view of everything, you know, a line is not a space of community. You know, it's just completely other, right? I mean, I don't know how thick is the line, but you know, it's completely other. It's not. Is it conceivable? And in any case, what is the cultural aim of this project? What is the cultural aim, really? terms of environment. What is, I don't understand it. I mean, but I don't know really what it is. And the question of buildings worth analyzing of recent date, yes, that's an interesting topic. Well, many, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, well, I think, of course, there are works by Ziza that are worth analyzing. The museum, Charalvish Museum in Porto is certainly worth analyzing, and well, many works by him are worth analyzing. But other architects, of course, I'm a little bit obsessed with him, of course. But yeah, well, I think there's very interesting work being done in China. That, I think, is without doubt, you know. So there are many buildings there, well, rather large buildings, in fact, that are worth analyzing. Well, you probably haven't heard of it, but Lia Jayakun's West End Yards in Chengdu are certainly worth analyzing.
And how about a building that's not? Something that you would
Oh, well, there's too many
not
of
happy
those.
with? There's give us one great example.
Too
One great
many of them.
example of like what's the
Yeah, fine, fine. Whatever.
Good evening. So you've said architecture at least 100 times, and I'm wondering what you mean by architecture. Is it the material artifact that encloses space, or is it the process of making it? And if it's the former, what does that have to do? How does that relate to the placemaking process, to the community building process, to the whole political process of creating the artifact? And is that some potential for pushing for change and being able to have a more empowered profession of architecture that's not just focused on the building and the artifact?
Right, well, it's a good question. And, but you have to have one before the other. If you don't have the client, the informed client, that wants something that is valuable, i.e. the community, a common client that, you know, desires something of value for itself, and has the economic power to realize it, then you can't even begin.
Let's assume the client is the public.
Sorry? What?
Client is the public.
Yeah, but the public is not active. Public is not active. I mean, generally, you know, the level of depoliticization in the United States is very extensive. It's not active. And if you have a public that's not active, you can't bring any of this into existence.
I know some people who are active.
Yeah, but the corporations dominate everything in this country. I mean, we are on a political threshold right now, I think, in this country. You know, corporations run everything. And, you know, the maldistribution of wealth is out of control. Where is the reaction to that? There's not really manifest reaction to that. That's why the democracy is in crisis, because, you know, it's hanging on by a thread, basically. Because the demagogic rhetoric of the media, you know, has taken over. I mean, where is the society that recognizes what is happening and desires something else?
I don't think it's the society. I think it's the small community groups that are doing organizing similar to what you're talking about by small
Yeah, but do they have
buildings.
any power economically? Can they really act? That's a question. I mean, can they really control the building of schools, etc., the building of community centers, the building of gardens? Can they really do that? I don't think they can. Where is the evidence that they can?
There has to be hope.
There has to be hope, but I mean, we also have to face reality. We have to. Otherwise, we can't begin any kind of discussion, I don't think.
So where do we go from here?
You have to be specific. You have to be specific about architectural education. You have to have a real intense argument about what do of course, I'm talking, I suppose I have to admit, about about the discourse in the School of Architecture in Columbia. But I think there's evidence of it elsewhere as well, that in a way, what is really essential to training an architect? How should an architect be trained? I think these questions are not really being profoundly asked inside schools of architecture anymore. Maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps Columbia is an aberration. But, I think that's a kind of community after all, I don't know what the answer is. Honest, I don't know the answer. But it seems to me evident that so much of society is controlled by enormous wealth and by corporations. Is that not the case?
Well, it's the case, but where there's power, there's resistance to power. And I think that's what we do as faculty, is to help students have the courage, like happens in other places in the world, to resist power.
Right, I know. But, I think, well, speaking for myself, I think the whole of my teaching life, I tried to do that. Maybe it didn't succeed, but I think that was, the argument. In a way.
Well, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I see. Good. I'm very honored that you're here, Sharon. Very honored you're here.
So, on that note, and what I'll say is that I've been transported back to time in which, after Kenneth would lecture, we would return to studio. And everyone would argue about what the hell he had just said.
Yeah, right.
And how to find a way forward. And it was in the resistance to that you do find this hope. I agree with you, Sharon. And I think, first of all, Kenneth, thank you so much for being here this evening.